The smell of damp earth and papyrus reeds carries a certain ancient weight, a scent that has lingered along the banks of the Nile for thousands of years, lingering long before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was ever hewn from the earth. It is a fragrance that speaks of life and the cyclical nature of time, where the rising waters bring fertility and the receding tide leaves behind a world reborn in rich black silt. In the year 1303, before the Common Era, this scent filled the air of the royal apartments, marking the arrival of a child who would eventually become the living embodiment of Egypt itself. This was the birth of Ramses II, a boy born into a lineage of soldiers and visionaries, a family that had only recently ascended to the throne, but was already reshaping the destiny of the world. His grandfather, the first Ramses, had been a general, a man of action, who stepped into the vacuum of power to stabilize a kingdom that had been shaken by religious upheaval and uncertainty. He reigned for only a brief window of time, but his legacy was the foundation of the 19th dynasty, a new era of strength and traditional restoration. And so, the young prince grew up in the shadow of his father, Seti I, a pharaoh who is often remembered as one of the most capable and sophisticated rulers to ever wear the double crown. Seti was a restorer of temples and a conqueror of horizons, a man who understood that the survival of Egypt depended on its ability to project power outward while maintaining a profound spiritual peace within. As the young Ramses walked the halls of the palaces in Memphis and Thebes, he was surrounded by the rhythmic sound of chisels hitting stone as his father worked tirelessly to carve the history of their people into the very bones of the land. The air in these courts was thick with the smoke of Kai-Fi incense, a blend of honey, wine, and resins that drifted through the high-ceilinged rooms, creating a sense of timelessness that must have settled deep within the boy's soul. As you settle into your blankets tonight and let the weight of the day drift away, you are joining a community of travelers who seek the quiet corners of the past. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather every single day to explore these ancient stories, drifting through history as a way to find rest. If you find these narrations helpful for your sleep, you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. And perhaps a gentle like on this video will help other weary souls find their way to our quiet fireside. Now, let us return to the cool, shaded corridors of the Egyptian court, where a young prince is beginning to learn the secrets of his station. The education of a prince in the new kingdom was not merely a matter of politics or warfare, but a deep immersion into the philosophical fabric of the universe. In the great scribal schools of the House of Life, Ramses would have spent hours bent over scrolls of papyrus, his fingers stained with the black and red ink of the scholar. He learned the complex dance of the hieroglyphs, understanding that words were not just tools for communication, but sacred vessels of power that could bring things into being. He studied the movements of the stars, watching the celestial procession of Sothis and the Great Bear, learning how the heavens mirrored the earthly realm. But above all else, he was taught the weight of Maat. Maat was more than a goddess. She was the concept of cosmic balance, the delicate equilibrium that kept the stars in their tracks and the river in its banks. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was the sole individual responsible for maintaining this balance. He was the bridge between the divine and the mundane. As Ramses watched his father perform the daily rituals in the dim, torchlit sanctuaries of Karnak, he saw the immense gravity of this duty. If the pharaoh failed to uphold Maat, the world would descend into Isfet, into chaos and darkness. This philosophical burden began to shape the young man's mind, instilling in him a sense of destiny that was both terrifying and magnificent. He was not just a boy, he was a god in waiting, a keeper of the light, who would one day be tasked with ensuring that the sun continued to rise over the two lands. As the years passed, the prince was often taken on journeys down the Nile, the great liquid highway that bound the empire together. From the deck of a royal barge, he would have watched the scenery drift by in a slow, rhythmic procession of green and gold. The sound of the water lapping against the hull provided a constant soothing backdrop to his thoughts, a reminder of the eternal flow of time. He saw the farmers in the fields, the fishermen casting their nets, and the vast, silent deserts that guarded the valley like golden sentinels. These journeys were his first lessons in the scale of his future kingdom, stretching from the cedar forests of the Levant to the gold mines of Nubia in the south. Meanwhile, his father Seti was preparing him for the more practical aspects of rule. By the age of 10, Ramses was already being treated as a co-commander of the army, learning the logistics of the chariot corps and the discipline of the infantry. He was a tall, athletic youth, possessing a natural charisma that drew people toward him like moths to a flame. He spent his days in the heat of the sun, mastering the composite bow and the long-handled Kopesh sword, feeling the grit of the desert sand against his skin. But even in the midst of his military training, the quiet reflections of the temple were never far away. He knew that a king must be a lion in battle, but a shepherd to his people, a dual nature that required a heart as steady as the mountains of the west. The sunset of his youth was a golden time, an era of prosperity and building that seemed as though it might last forever. The empire was stable, the granaries were full, and the gods seemed pleased with the offerings of the 19th dynasty. As the light of the day would begin to soften, turning the limestone cliffs of the Theban hills into a shimmering shade of violet, the young Ramses might have stood on a balcony overlooking the river, listening to the distant sound of flutes and the evening call of the birds. He was standing on the threshold of a reign that would span 67 years, a reign that would see him become the greatest builder and the most prolific father in the history of his nation. But for now, he was simply a young man, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley, feeling the cool evening breeze of the Nile on his face, and preparing himself for the heavy, beautiful crown that would one day rest upon his brow. The scent of cedar oil and hot copper hung heavy in the dry air of the royal workshops, a sharp contrast to the sweet lilies of the palace gardens. It was here, amidst the rhythmic ringing of hammers against bronze, that the young Ramses first truly understood the weight of his destiny. He was not yet a man when his father, the formidable Seti I, named him co-regent, placing the flail and the crook into hands that were still growing. This was no mere honorary title. It was a baptism in the realities of power. While other youths his age might have spent their days in idle sport, Ramses was already learning the language of the empire. The sound of chariot wheels on stone, the rustle of papyrus reports from distant borders, and the steady, unwavering gaze required of a leader who is seen not just as a man, but as the physical manifestation of the divine. His first true test came far from the gilded halls of Thebes, in the harsh, wind-swept reaches of the western desert. The Libyans had been restless, their raiding parties casting long shadows over the fertile edges of the delta. Seti, wise and calculating, chose this moment to blood his son in the crucible of command. Imagine the young prince standing at the head of a column of thousands, the dust of the march coating his skin like a second layer of armor. The military camps of ancient Egypt were cities unto themselves, a rhythmic chaos of neighing horses, the smell of roasting grain over open fires, and the low murmur of soldiers sharpening their blades under the vast, indifferent canopy of the stars. It was in these camps that Ramses learned the names of his generals and the grievances of his foot soldiers, forging a bond with the army that would become the bedrock of his long reign. The chariot was his throne on the battlefield, a masterpiece of engineering that felt more like a living creature than a vehicle of war. To look upon a royal chariot of the 19th dynasty was to see the pinnacle of ancient craftsmanship, The frame was made of supple, heat-treated wood, bent into elegant curves that could absorb the shock of a high-speed gallop over uneven sand. Its floor was a woven mesh of leather thongs, providing a springy platform for the archer to maintain his balance. Every inch was adorned with gold leaf and semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli as blue as the deep midnight sky, and carnelian as red as the setting sun. As Ramses gripped the reins, he could feel the vibration of the earth through the thin wooden wheels, a constant low-frequency hum that signaled the terrifying power at his disposal. The chariot was light enough for 2 men to carry over difficult terrain, yet sturdy enough to carry a god into the heart of the fray. The campaigns in Libya were swift and decisive, serving as a message to the world that the lion's cub had found his teeth. But a far more profound transition was quiet, internal, and inevitable. When the news finally came that Seti I had passed into the beautiful west, travelling the celestial river to join his ancestors, the world seemed to hold its breath. For Ramses, this was the moment of the great shattering, the instant where the prince died and the pharaoh was born. In the Egyptian mind, the king was the linchpin of the universe, the one responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance between order and chaos. As the funeral rites began and the scent of frankincense filled the Valley of the Kings, Ramses felt the psychological shift. He was no longer a son looking to a father for guidance. He was the Ka of his people, the living Horus, a bridge between the fleeting world of men and the eternal realm of the gods. The transition was marked by a sudden quiet intensity. The young king did not retreat into mourning. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the stones of the earth. He possessed an ambition that bordered on the infinite, a desire to write his name so deeply into the landscape of Egypt that time itself could never erase it. His initial building projects were not merely structures, they were declarations of intent. At Abydos, he completed the magnificent temple his father had started, but he did so with a flourish that was uniquely his own. He looked at the works of the great kings who came before him, the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, the soaring columns of the Middle Kingdom, and he decided that his legacy would surpass them all, not just in beauty, but in sheer, overwhelming scale. He began to transform the face of the Nile. In the city of Thebes, he commanded his architects to expand the great temple of Amun at Karnak, envisioning a hall of pillars so vast that a man might wander for a lifetime and never see the same carving twice. He saw the potential in the raw cliffs of Nubia and the sun-drenched plains of the north. Every monument was designed to capture the light in a specific way. The morning sun striking a colossal statue's face just so, or the shadows of the evening lengthening across a pylon to tell a story of victory and divine favor. This was the beginning of his obsession with the eternal. He understood that flesh was weak and memory was fickle, but granite was forever. As the first years of his solo reign unfolded, the young pharaoh moved with a restless energy. He travelled the length of the river, his golden barge cutting through the silt-heavy waters like a shimmering needle. He was everywhere at once, overseeing the opening of new quarries, the irrigation of new fields, and the training of new divisions of his army. The people watched him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He was charismatic, tall, and possessed a shock of reddish-gold hair that seemed to catch the fire of the sun itself. To the common farmer, tilling his plot by the riverbank, the sight of the royal procession was a reminder that the world was in good hands, that the Nile would rise, the grain would grow, and the enemies of Egypt would be kept at bay by the strength of this young, vibrant god-king. The air in the palace during these early years was electric with the sense of a new era. The scribes worked late into the night by the flickering light of oil lamps, recording his decrees and cataloguing the tributes flowing in from the corners of the known world. Ramses was not content to simply rule. He wanted to reinvent the very concept of the pharaoh. He began to plan a new capital in the north, Pi-Ramesses, a city of turquoise-tiled palaces and lush gardens that would serve as a strategic base for his ambitions in Asia. It was a bold move, shifting the center of gravity away from the traditional power centers of the south, signaling to the Hittites and the Syrians that the eyes of Egypt were now turned firmly toward their borders. In the quiet moments of the night, perhaps while sitting on a balcony overlooking the darkened river, Ramses might have reflected on the sheer speed of his ascent. Only a few years prior, he had been a student of the scribes and a trainee of the generals. Now the destiny of millions rested upon his shoulders. He could hear the distant sound of the temple singers, their voices rising in a haunting, melodic plea for his continued health and prosperity. The weight of the crown was heavy, yes, but it was a weight he had been born to carry. He felt the pulse of the land beneath him, the steady heartbeat of a nation that had endured for 2,000 years and would, under his guidance, reach its absolute zenith. The young regent had become the undisputed master of the two lands. The military expeditions to Libya had been the prelude. The building projects were the overture. The main act of his life was about to begin, a drama that would involve world-shaking battles, complex diplomacy, and a search for immortality that would eventually lead him to the very edges of the known world. But for now, as the moon rose over the limestone cliffs, casting a pale, silvery glow over the silent sphinxes and the towering obelisks, Ramses the Great simply breathed, drawing in the cool night air of an empire that was, at long last, entirely his own. The rhythmic clatter of chariot wheels against the sun-baked earth of the Levant is a sound that echoes through the corridors of time, a steady, hypnotic pulse that signaled the end of a fragile peace. For generations, the borders between the Egyptian Empire and the Hittite kingdom in the north had been a shifting landscape of tension, a vast chessboard where two titans of the ancient world watched one another with wary, unblinking eyes. The Hittites, masters of iron and formidable strategists from the rugged highlands of Anatolia, had been slowly expanding their influence southward, creeping like a long shadow into the fertile plains of Syria. To Ramses, this was not merely a territorial dispute. It was a challenge to the very order of the cosmos, an affront to the divine balance he was sworn to protect as the living Horus on earth. As the 5th year of his reign dawned, the young pharaoh decided that the time for quiet diplomacy had passed, and the time for the bronze-tipped spear had arrived. He gathered an immense host, divided into 4 great divisions named after the primary gods of the land, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. It was a slow, deliberate march, thousands of sandals treading upon the dusty roads, a river of humanity flowing toward the Orontes River. Ramses rode at the head of the division of Amun, his golden armor catching the light, his mind focused on the strategic city of Kadesh. This walled fortress was the key to the region, a gateway that had long been under Hittite influence, and the pharaoh intended to reclaim it, believing that a swift, decisive blow would cement his legacy and secure his borders for a lifetime. The air grew heavy and still as the Egyptian vanguard approached the outskirts of Kadesh, the silence of the valley broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was here, amidst the shimmering heat haze of the afternoon, that the fog of war began to settle. 2 Shasu nomads were brought before Ramses, claiming to be deserters from the Hittite army. They spoke with practiced ease, telling the pharaoh that the great king of the Hittites, Muwatalli II, was far to the north, too afraid to face the might of Egypt. Ramses, fueled by the confidence of youth and the desire for a swift victory, believed them. He pushed his division forward, leaving the other 3 groups miles behind, stretching his lines thin across the rugged terrain. He did not know that the nomads were spies, and that just behind the high walls of Kadesh, Hidden by the contours of the land, the entire Hittite army lay in wait. 10,000 soldiers and 2,500 chariots, coiled like a serpent, ready to strike. The transition from peace to chaos was instantaneous. As the Egyptian soldiers began to pitch their camp, weary from the day's march and unaware of the danger, the Hittite chariotry erupted from the eastern bank of the river. They did not strike the camp directly at first. Instead, they crashed into the division of Ra, which was still moving through the open fields to join the Pharaoh. The impact was devastating. The Hittite chariots were heavier than the Egyptian ones, carrying 3 men instead of 2, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a warrior with a long, reaching spear. They tore through the Egyptian ranks like a scythe through wheat, sending the terrified soldiers fleeing toward the camp of Amun, where Ramses sat, unsuspecting, in his royal tent. Suddenly, the horizon was filled with the dust of 1,000 hooves and the terrifying roar of an approaching storm. The camp was overrun. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped the Egyptian ranks as the Hittite chariots smashed through the makeshift barricades. In this moment of absolute peril, when the empire seemed poised on the brink of total collapse, Ramses the Great did not flee. History tells us, through the poetic accounts inscribed on temple walls, that he stood alone against the surging tide. He donned his armor, took up his bow, and called upon Amun to steady his hand. Whether through divine intervention or the sheer, desperate bravery of a man with nowhere left to turn, Ramses led a series of frantic countercharges. He moved with a fluidity that defied the chaos around him, his chariot a streak of gold amidst the brown dust, weaving through the Hittite lines and striking down those who dared to approach her. The battle became a swirling, disorganized mass of bronze and blood, a stalemate of endurance. The Hittites, distracted by the rich spoils of the Egyptian camp, began to loot the royal tents, losing their tactical cohesion. This brief window of greed allowed the remnants of the Egyptian forces to rally. Just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the battlefield, a reserve force of elite Egyptian soldiers arrived from the coast. Their sudden appearance turned the tide, forcing the Hittites back toward the river. Men and horses struggled in the churning waters of the Orontes, gasping for breath as the weight of their armor pulled them beneath the surface. By the time the moon rose over the silent, broken chariots and the cooling earth, the field was a graveyard of ambition. Neither side could claim a true victory. The Hittites remained safely behind the walls of Kadesh, and the Egyptians, though they had survived the ambush, lacked the strength to take the city. In the aftermath of the bloodletting, a strange and heavy silence settled over the two empires. The years that followed Kadesh were marked by smaller skirmishes and a growing realization that neither power could utterly destroy the other without destroying themselves. The cost of constant mobilization was draining the treasuries, and a new threat was rising in the east, the Assyrians, who watched the two exhausted giants with predatory interest. And so the path of the sword began to give way to the path of the reed pen. Diplomacy, slow and methodical, replaced the frantic energy of the chariot charge. Nearly 15 years after the dust had settled at Kadesh, a remarkable event occurred, one that would change the course of human history. Envoys travelled between the grand palaces of Pyrameses and the Hittite capital of Hattusa, carrying silver tablets inscribed with a promise. This was the signing of the world's first known peace treaty, a document of profound sophistication and humanity. It was not merely a ceasefire, but a treaty of eternal peace, a commitment to mutual defense and the extradition of political refugees. The text, written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, spoke of a brotherhood between Ramses and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III. It declared that peace and brotherhood shall be between us forever. The great chief of the Hittites shall not invade the land of Egypt, and Ramses, the great ruler of Egypt, shall not invade the land of the Hittites. This transition from the roar of battle to the quiet scratch of a stylus on silver represented a monumental shift in the pharaoh's reign. The young warrior, who had once sought glory through the edge of a blade, had matured into a statesman who understood that the true strength of an empire lay in its stability. To seal this newfound bond, Ramses eventually married a Hittite princess, welcoming her into his court with great ceremony, an act that turned former enemies into kin. The borders became porous once more, not for armies, but for merchants carrying cedar wood, precious oils, and lapis lazuli. As we reflect on the clashes at Kadesh, we see a ruler who was forged in the fire of a near disaster. The narrow escape from the Hittite ambush stayed with Ramses for the rest of his long life, perhaps serving as a reminder of the fragility of power. He would spend the following decades immortalizing the battle on the walls of nearly every temple he built, from the Ramesseum to Abu Simbel, portraying himself as a solitary hero saved by divine grace. While the historical reality was a tactical draw, the spiritual and political outcome was a triumph of endurance. The Great Peace allowed Egypt to enter a golden age of construction and cultural flowering, a time when the resources once spent on chariots were redirected into the soaring columns of Karnak and the silent, eternal beauty of the Valley of the Queens. The echoes of the Orontes River eventually faded, replaced by the rhythmic sound of stonemasons' hammers and the gentle splashing of the Nile against the hulls of grain ships. Ramses had learned that while a king must be a lion in the field, he must also be a shepherd of his people's prosperity. And so, the empire settled into a long, warm afternoon of peace, a period where the sun seemed to linger just a little longer over the temples, and the threat of the northern shadow was finally, mercifully, held at bay by a few words carved in silver. Deep within the delta of the Nile, where the earth is soft and heavy with the scent of damp reeds and dark silt, there is a lingering memory of a city that once stood as the jewel of the north. This was Pi-Ramesses, the great house of Ramses, a shimmering metropolis of turquoise tiles and rose-colored granite that the pharaoh built to be his seat of power, far from the ancient shadows of Thebes. To walk its streets in those days was to walk through a dream of imperial perfection, where gardens bloomed with exotic flowers brought from the ends of the earth, and the air was thick with the sweet, heavy perfume of blue lotus. But beneath this veneer of tranquility, the history of this place is intertwined with a much older, more turbulent story, a story that has echoed through the millennia, whispered by scholars and believers alike, casting Ramses as the central figure in one of humanity's most enduring dramas. It is here, in the construction of this magnificent capital, that the historical record begins to brush against the sacred verses of the Book of Exodus. For centuries, theologians and historians have looked upon Ramses II as the most likely candidate for the pharaoh of the biblical narrative, the king who knew not Joseph. The connection is rooted in the very stones of the city itself. The biblical text mentions the labor of the Israelites in the building of Pithom and Ramses, and as we look at the archaeological remains of the delta, we find evidence of a vast, multi-ethnic workforce. Among the native Egyptians were Semitic populations, migrants from the Levant who had settled in the fertile lands of Goshen over generations. They were the builders, the brickmakers, and the laborers whose hands shaped the mud of the Nile into the foundations of an empire. Life for these groups was a cycle of heat and heavy toil, a rhythm of existence dictated by the rising of the sun and the demands of the royal overseers. We can almost hear the rhythmic thud of the wooden molds as they were filled with wet clay and straw, the sound of thousands of bricks drying in the relentless Egyptian sun. In the quiet of a desert evening, it is easy to imagine the weariness of those workers, looking toward the horizon and yearning for a liberation that seemed as distant as the stars. While the official records of Ramses speak only of his triumphs and his divine right to rule, the silent archaeology of the Delta tells a story of a society in flux, where the friction between a centralized power and a displaced people was beginning to spark a fire that would eventually illuminate the pages of history. As we delve deeper into this intersection of myth and reality, we encounter the mysterious Habiru, a term found in ancient Egyptian and Near Eastern texts that describes a class of people who lived on the fringes of society. They were nomads, mercenaries, and laborers, men and women, without a fixed home who moved through the shadows of the great empires. Many scholars suggest that the word Hebrew finds its linguistic roots here. Among these outsiders who existed within the Egyptian state but were never truly of it, Ramses, in his quest for eternal glory, may have seen these populations simply as a resource to be managed, a force to be harnessed for the glory of the gods. But history suggests that within this marginalized community, a sense of identity was beginning to crystallize, fueled by a shared suffering and a growing hope for a different kind of kingdom. And then, according to the ancient tradition, the peace of the Nile was shattered, not by an invading army, but by a series of calamities that struck at the very heart of Egyptian life. To the modern ear, the 10 plagues are a sequence of supernatural events, but when viewed through the lens of ancient Egyptian cosmology, they take on a deeper, more symbolic meaning. Each plague can be seen as a direct challenge to the authority of the Egyptian gods, a divine trial of strength played out on the banks of the sacred river. When the waters of the Nile turned to blood, it was not merely a physical catastrophe, it was an assault on Hapi, the god of the inundation, the one who brought life to the valley. The frogs, the lice, and the flies were more than just pests. They were disruptions of the Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe that the Pharaoh was sworn to protect. Imagine the atmosphere in the royal court as these events unfolded, the confusion of the priests, the growing unease of the advisors, and the iron-willed resolve of Ramses himself. For a king who believed he was the living embodiment of Horus, these disasters were a personal affront, a tearing of the fabric of reality. The darkness that fell over the land for 3 days was a strike against Ra, the sun god, and the Pharaoh's own divine father. In the stillness of that unnatural night, the silence must have been heavy with a weight that no amount of incense or prayer could lift. It was a contest of wills between an earthly god-king and a power that claimed authority over the very elements of creation, a moment where the certainties of the Bronze Age began to tremble. The historical search for the Exodus is a journey through a landscape of fragments and silences. Egyptian records, focused as they were on the glorification of the king, rarely recorded defeats or internal upheavals that did not end in total victory. And yet, the echoes of this period remain. We find them in the sudden abandonment of certain settlements in the Delta, in the shifting patterns of pottery, and in the enduring memory of a people who claimed to have walked out of the house of bondage and into the wilderness. Whether the Exodus occurred exactly as described or represents a poetic distillation of a long, complex process of migration and liberation, the shadow it casts over the reign of Ramses is undeniable. He remains for all time the Pharaoh of the confrontation, the monarch who stood at the threshold of a new era of faith. As the years of his long reign continued, the memory of these tensions likely faded into the background of his many other achievements. Ramses was a master of narrative, and he ensured that the walls of his temples told the story he wanted the world to remember, a story of strength, of divine favor, and of an empire that would never fall. But for the listener today, drifting towards sleep, the image of Ramses is made more human by these stories of struggle. We see a man who was not just a stone monument, but a ruler grappling with forces he could not fully control. A king who watched the sun set over a changing world. The city of Pi-Rameses, once so vibrant and full of life, eventually succumbed to the shifting of the Nile's branches. The river that had given the city its life eventually moved away, leaving the great palaces and temples to be swallowed by the silt and the reeds. Today, very little remains above the ground, but the story of what happened there continues to fascinate. It is a reminder that even the greatest of kings are part of a larger tapestry, a weave of history and belief that stretches far beyond the horizon of a single lifetime. As we rest, we can imagine the wind blowing across the delta, carrying the faint scent of the sea and the echoes of ancient voices, telling a tale of bricks and water, of plagues and promises, and of a king who became a legend in the shadow of a miracle. The night remains still over the ruins of the delta, and the stars that watched over Ramses continue their slow, silent dance across the sky. The questions of history, while important, seem to soften in the quiet hours. We are left with the image of a great river flowing eternally toward the sea, carrying with it the memories of all who have walked its banks. In this space between the past and the present, the figure of Ramses the Great stands as a bridge, a man of his time who became a symbol for all time, a pharaoh whose legacy is written not just in stone, but in the very soul of human storytelling. And so, we let the history rest, allowing the gentle rhythm of the Nile to guide us into a deep and peaceful sleep, where the shadows of the past are nothing more than the soft curtains of a dream. Consider for a moment the sound of a single copper chisel meeting the surface of dark, unyielding granite, a rhythmic metallic ring that echoes through the Valley of the Kings, repeating 1,000 times a day, 10,000 times a year. It is a slow, methodical music, the heartbeat of an empire translated into the language of stone. For Ramses, the world was not merely a place to inhabit, but a canvas to be sculpted, a raw and silent landscape waiting to be given a voice that would carry across the vast oceans of time. He understood, perhaps better than any ruler before or since, that flesh is a fleeting thing, but a mountain can be made to remember. As we drift further into the quiet history of this ancient land, we find ourselves standing before the great temple of Abu Simbel, where the pharaoh did not merely build upon the earth, but reached deep inside it. Here, the living rock of the mountain was hollowed out with such precision that the boundary between nature and artifice began to blur. 4 colossal figures of Ramses sit in eternal repose against the cliffside, their hands resting on their knees, their eyes looking out toward the eastern horizon with a gaze that is both heavy with responsibility and light with divine certainty. They are 60 feet tall, carved directly from the sandstone, and as the desert wind brushes against their stone faces, it carries with it the fine golden dust of centuries. If we were to walk between these giants and enter the cool, dim interior of the mountain, we would find ourselves in a sanctuary where the very light of the heavens is invited to participate in the architecture. Twice a year, on the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, the rising sun aligns perfectly with the entrance of the temple. The first rays of dawn travel like a golden spear through the long, dark hall, penetrating 200 feet into the heart of the rock to illuminate the statues in the inner sanctum. It is a moment of celestial theatre, a silent dialogue between the pharaoh and the sun god Ra, where the physical world and the spiritual world meet in a single, focused beam of light. The air inside is still and carries the faint earthy scent of ancient stone, a coolness that settles over the skin like a soft blanket, shielding us from the heat of the world outside. And so, the spirit of Ramses continues to manifest in the grandest of scales, moving from the isolated cliffs of the south to the sprawling heart of the kingdom at Karnak. Imagine a forest, not of wood and leaf, but of massive, towering columns that seem to hold up the very sky. In the great hypostyle hall, Ramses expanded upon the work of his ancestors, overseeing the completion of a space so vast that it defies the human imagination. 134 columns rise toward the ceiling, the largest among them reaching nearly 80 feet into the air, their capitals blossoming like giant papyrus flowers. As you walk through this stone forest, the shadows play across the deeply carved hieroglyphs that wrap around every inch of the surface. You can almost feel the presence of the craftsmen who spent their lives here, perched on wooden scaffolding, their hands steady as they smoothed the stone and applied vibrant pigments of blue, red, and gold. The scale of the hall creates a natural hush, a cathedral-like silence where every footstep is softened by the sand on the floor. It is a place designed to make one feel small, not out of cruelty, but out of a sense of wonder, reminding the soul of the infinite nature of the gods and the king who served as their earthly shadow. Meanwhile, on the western bank of the Nile, where the sun sets and the realm of the afterlife begins, Ramses constructed his mortuary temple, known to us now as the Ramesseum. This was his temple of millions of years, a sanctuary dedicated to his own eternal memory and his union with the god Amun. Today, much of it lies in a state of graceful decay, with fallen giants resting in the dust, but even in its fragmentation, it possesses a profound and quiet dignity. The great fallen Colossus, a statue that once stood nearly 60 feet tall and weighed over 1,000 tons, now lies in pieces, its polished granite surface still smooth to the touch. There is a strange peace in these ruins, a feeling that time has done its work and now allows the stone to rest. The Ramesseum was once a center of learning and administration, housing a vast library known as the House of Life, where scribes recorded the wisdom of the ages on scrolls of papyrus. You can almost hear the soft scratching of reeds against fiber, the hushed whispers of scholars debating the movements of the stars, and the distant rhythmic chime of those copper chisels still working on the far side of the river. The artistry of the craftsman was not merely a job, but a form of prayer, a belief that by capturing the likeness of the king in the hardest stone, they were ensuring his breath would continue forever. As the years passed, the landscape of Egypt became a mirror of Ramses's ambition, with obelisks pointing like frozen fingers toward the heavens and pylons standing like massive gateways between the mundane and the divine. The granite used for these monuments often traveled hundreds of miles down the Nile on great wooden barges, a slow and steady journey that mirrored the flow of life itself. The stone was quarried at Aswan, where the river narrows and the rocks turn a deep rose-colored hue. You can imagine the laborers working in the cool of the early morning, using wooden wedges soaked in water to split the stone with surgical precision, the sound of the river lapping against the hull of a transport ship, the creak of heavy ropes under tension, the collective breath of 1,000 men moving in unison. These are the invisible threads that hold the monuments together. Every block of stone carries the energy of the hands that shaped it, the warmth of the sun that baked it, and the vision of the man who commanded it to be. Ramses did not just build temples, he built a legacy of permanence in a world of shifting sands. He understood that while the river might flood and the seasons might change, the spirit of a people is anchored by the beauty they create. And so, as we linger in the shadow of these great stone forests, the weight of the day seems to lift, replaced by the heavy, comforting stillness of the monuments themselves. The columns of Karnak, the giants of Abu Simbel, and the quiet halls of the Ramesseum all stand as silent guardians of a history that refuses to fade. They invite us to slow our breathing, to match the pace of the stone, and to find a sense of enduring peace in the knowledge that some things are meant to last. The artistry of the past becomes a lullaby for the present, a gentle reminder that even the greatest of kings found rest at the end of their labors, leaving behind a world of wonder for us to dream within. The air grows cooler now, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant, sweet fragrance of blooming lotus from the river's edge. The stars begin to appear above the pylons, the same stars that the ancient astronomers tracked from the temple roofs 3,000 years ago. In this vast and silent theatre of history, there is no rush, no noise, only the slow, rhythmic pulse of the Nile and the steady, unchanging presence of the stone. We are invited to close our eyes and let the images of these great monuments drift through our minds like soft clouds, each one a testament to a life lived with purpose, and a sleep earned through the passage of many long and fruitful years. A single delicate scent of blue lotus drifts through the open columns of the palace, carrying with it the quiet intimacy of a world behind the heavy stone walls of statecraft. Beyond the colossal statues and the thunder of chariot wheels, there existed a soft, private reality where the heart of the Pharaoh found its rest. At the center of this world stood a woman whose name meant the most beautiful of them all, the great royal wife, Nefertari. She was not merely a queen in the shadow of a god-king, but a force of grace and intellect that softened the iron edges of Ramses' long reign. History often remembers the conqueror, but the inscriptions on the temple walls at Abu Simbel tell a more tender story, for there Ramses carved her image at the same scale as his own, a rare and profound gesture of equality that whispered of a love reaching far beyond the requirements of dynasty. As the years passed, Nefertari became his most trusted advisor, a steady hand in the complex dance of international diplomacy. We can imagine her in the cool of the evening, her linen robes rustling softly against the tiled floors as she dictated letters to the queens of distant lands, her voice a calming melody in the heat of the Egyptian twilight. She was the mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, a woman of such presence that the sun itself was said to shine for her. In the quiet moments away from the court, within the lush, irrigated gardens of the royal palaces, the air was thick with the fragrance of jasmine and the gentle splashing of water from ornamental ponds. Here, the Pharaoh was not a living god, but a husband and a father, walking through groves of pomegranate and sycamore trees, watching the dappled sunlight play across the surface of the pools, where papyrus reeds swayed in the breeze. The domestic life of Ramses was as vast and sprawling as the empire he commanded. The royal family was a small city unto itself, a vibrant tapestry of dozens of sons and daughters who filled the palace corridors with the sounds of laughter and life. We see their names recorded on the walls of monuments: Prince Kayemwaset, the scholar and priest who sought to preserve the ancient wisdom of his ancestors, and Princess Bintenath, who walked with the poise of her mother. This was a house of abundance, where the wealth of the Nile provided every comfort, from the finest honey-sweetened cakes to the softest linens woven by the most skilled hands in the land. The palace was a sanctuary of green in a world of golden sand, a place where the rhythmic sound of the gardeners tending to the vines created a steady, hypnotic backdrop to the passing of the days. When the time finally came for Nefertari to transition into the eternal fields of the afterlife, Ramses ensured that her journey would be draped in unparalleled beauty. High in the Valley of the Queens, hidden within the limestone cliffs, lies her tomb, a place often called the Sistine Chapel of ancient Egypt. To step into this sacred space is to leave the world of the living behind and enter a realm of vivid, eternal color. The walls are alive with paintings that have remained breathtakingly bright for over 3,000 years. We see Nefertari dressed in a gown of pure white, her eyes lined with kohl, her skin glowing with the warmth of a perpetual dawn. She plays a game of Sene against an unseen opponent, her fingers poised over the pieces as she navigates the challenges of the underworld with a serene confidence. The ceilings of her tomb are painted a deep midnight blue, scattered with thousands of golden stars that seem to twinkle in the low light of a handheld lamp. It is a silent, subterranean sky that never clouds and never fades. As we move deeper into the chambers, the air grows cool and still, the silence so profound that one can almost hear the heartbeat of history. Every inch of the plaster is covered in protective spells and images of the gods. Osiris in his emerald robes, Isis with her protective wings outstretched, and Anubis guarding the threshold. Nefertari moves through these scenes with a quiet dignity, led by the hand by goddesses who treat her as a sister. It is a place of absolute peace, a cocoon of art and devotion designed to keep her spirit safe through the rolling cycles of time. This devotion to his family was a cornerstone of Ramses' identity. He was a man who built for eternity, but he also built for those he loved. The sprawling complex known as the Ramesseum, though a monument to his own glory, also served as a center for the education and upbringing of his many children, ensuring that his lineage would be as enduring as the stone of the pyramids. We can picture the royal children playing in the courtyards, their small sandals slapping against the polished stone, unaware that their names would be read by scholars thousands of years into the future. The pharaoh's domestic life was a reflection of the cosmic order he sought to maintain, a balance of power and tenderness, of public majesty and private warmth. As the evening shadows stretch long over the palaces of Pi-Ramses, the city begins to settle. The gardeners put away their tools, the water wheels slow their turning, and the scent of the evening meal wafts through the air. The vastness of the royal family meant that the palace was never truly silent, yet there was a deep sense of security within those walls. Ramses, perhaps standing on a balcony overlooking the Nile, would have seen the reflection of the moon in the river, a silver path leading toward the horizon. He was a man who had everything a mortal could desire, yet his greatest pride lay in the faces of his children and the memory of the woman who had stood by his side through the decades of his ascent. The gardens were a testament to the pharaoh's ability to command the very elements. Through a sophisticated system of canals and sluices, the desert was held at bay, replaced by emerald lawns and shaded bowers where the royal family could escape the midday sun. There were exotic animals brought from the southern lands, graceful gazelles and colorful birds whose songs filled the morning air. It was a world of sensory richness, where the touch of a cool breeze and the taste of a fresh fig were celebrated as gifts from the gods. In this lush environment, the pressures of the throne seemed to melt away, replaced by the simple, enduring rhythms of family life. Nefertari's influence stretched far beyond the palace gardens, reaching into the very heart of Egyptian spirituality. She was often depicted performing religious rites alongside her husband, her presence essential to the harmony of the rituals. Together, they were the bridge between the divine and the earthly, a dual representation of the masculine and feminine forces that governed the universe. And yet, when we look at the small details of her tomb, the way her jewelry is painted with such precision, or the gentle curve of her smile, we see the individual woman who captured the heart of the most powerful man on earth. The story of Ramses and Nefertari is a reminder that even amidst the grand scale of empires and the heavy weight of gold, the human experience remains centered on the connections we forge. The stone monuments may crumble and the names may fade, but the intent behind them, the desire to honor a loved one, to protect a child, to create a home, remains as clear today as it was 3 millennia ago. As we drift further into the quiet of the night, we can let the image of the star-covered ceiling in Nefertari's tomb fill our vision. Each star is a steady point of light in the darkness, a symbol of a love that refused to be forgotten, and a family that flourished under the watchful eye of a pharaoh who was, at his core, a man who cherished his own. The Nile continues its slow, patient journey toward the sea, carrying the memories of the palace gardens and the echoes of the royal children's laughter. The air is cool, the world is still, and the legacy of the great royal wife remains etched in the very bedrock of the valley. We breathe in the scent of the ancient lotus, and we let the weight of the day fall away, sinking into a rest as deep and as beautiful as the tomb of the queen, where the stars never set and the silence is a warm embrace. In this space there is only the gentle flow of time, the soft rustle of history, and the enduring peace of a house built on the foundations of a love that reached for the heavens. The white linen of the Pharaoh's robes catches the light of 1,000 flickering oil lamps, casting long, rhythmic shadows against the limestone walls of the great hall at Pi Ramesses. There is a specific sound to this era of the king's life, the soft, rhythmic chanting of priests that has continued, almost without interruption, for more than 6 decades. It is a drone as steady as the heartbeat of the Nile, a sound that signals not an end, but a continuous, shimmering renewal. By the time Ramses reaches the 30th year of his reign, he has already outlived the expectations of his doctors and the lifespans of many of his own children. Yet, according to the ancient traditions of the said festival, he is not a man nearing the end, but a god preparing to be reborn. We see him now, no longer the young warrior leaping into his chariot at Kadesh, but a silver-haired patriarch, draped in the ceremonial cloak of the Jubilee, walking with a slow, deliberate grace through the courtyards of his capital. As the years stretch on, the said festivals become more frequent, occurring every 3 years, then every 2, as if the Pharaoh is racing against the very concept of time. Each ceremony is a masterpiece of sensory abundance. The heavy, sweet scent of frankincense and myrrh billowing from golden censers, the cool touch of holy water sprinkled by the high priest, and the sight of the king running the ritual course to prove his physical vitality. Even as his joints begin to stiffen, and the weight of the double crown feels heavier upon his brow, the magic of the ritual sustains the illusion of eternal youth. In the eyes of his people, Ramses is not merely a man who has grown old, he is the living embodiment of Egypt itself, a land that refuses to wither, a river that never fails to rise. The landscape of Egypt during this long afternoon of his reign is one of unparalleled, golden prosperity. The granaries are bursting with the surplus of 12 peaceful harvests, and the trade routes from the turquoise mines of Sinai to the gold fields of Kush are bustling with activity. Yet beneath this veneer of absolute stability, the world is beginning to shift in ways that even a god-king cannot entirely control. To the north and west, the great green sea stirs with the movements of displaced peoples, and the borders of the empire, once so sharply defined by the edge of a sword, begin to feel the first, faint tremors of a changing world. But for now, in the heart of the 2 lands, there is only the stillness of a long, warm afternoon. The great Harris papyrus tells of a time when the people slept with their doors unlocked. So secure was the peace established by the son of Seti. Ramses watches his kingdom from the balconies of his palace, seeing the city of Pi Ramesses grow into a sprawling metropolis of turquoise-tiled villas and lush gardens. He is surrounded by a sprawling family tree, a forest of princes and princesses who carry his name into every corner of the administration. But time, the great leveller, begins to thin the ranks of his inner circle. One by one, the companions of his youth depart for the west. His beloved Nefertari is long since gone, her memory preserved in the vibrant colours of her tomb. His eldest sons, the warriors and scholars who were meant to carry his torch, also precede him into the afterlife. Among those who remain, a quiet figure emerges from the shadows of the royal court. Merneptah, the 13th son. He was never intended for the throne, having spent much of his life in the shadow of his elder brothers, yet as the decades pass, he finds himself elevated by the simple, somber reality of survival. Merneptah is a man already in his 50s or 60s when he begins to take on the burdens of the state, acting as his father's regent. We can imagine the two of them walking together through the cool, shaded colonnades of the palace, the ancient king, his skin like fine weathered parchment, and the aging prince, both of them acutely aware of the monumental legacy that is being passed from hand to hand. There is a profound, almost heavy silence that accompanies a reign of 66 years. It is a span of time that defies the human imagination, a period so long that most of the Egyptian population has never known a world without Ramses on the throne. To the common farmer tilling his field near Memphis, Ramses is as permanent as the sun or the mountains. The pharaoh has become a monument in his own right, a living statue that breathes and speaks. As he sits upon the throne in his final years, perhaps he reflects on the sheer scale of his existence. The hundreds of statues he commissioned, the temples he carved into the very bones of the earth, and the peace treaty with the Hittites that has now lasted for nearly 2 generations. The pace of life in the palace slows to a gentle crawl. The frantic energy of the building projects has settled into a steady rhythm of maintenance and quiet expansion. The air is thick with the dust of history, and the sunlight that filters through the high clerestory windows seems to hold a deeper, more amber hue. Ramses, the great ancestor, spends his days in the company of his scribes and his youngest children, his voice a soft rasp as he recounts the stories of a world that few others can remember. He speaks of the day he was crowned in the temple of Amun, of the scent of the dust on the road to Syria, and of the way the moonlight looked on the face of the queen of the Hittites when she arrived to seal their peace. As we drift deeper into this state of rest, we feel the weight of these 66 years as a comforting blanket, a sense of completion that only comes at the end of a long and storied journey. The decline of Egypt is still a distant cloud on the horizon, invisible to those living in the warmth of the Ramesside sun. For now, there is only the soft exhale of a kingdom at rest, a land that has reached its peak and is content to linger there for just a little while longer. The Nile flows on, indifferent to the passage of kings, its waters cool and dark as they carry the silt of the south toward the sea. We can almost hear the scratch of the reed pen on papyrus as the royal chroniclers struggle to keep pace with a life that has spanned so many eras. They write of the king's health, of the offerings made at the altars of Ptah and Re, and of the quiet transition of power that is taking place in the heart of the palace. Merneptah stands ready, a steady hand to catch the crook and the flail when they finally slip from his father's grasp. There is no chaos, no struggle, only the natural, inevitable turning of the great wheel. The weight of the day has fully dissipated now, replaced by the cool nocturnal air of the Egyptian night. We are floating on the current of this ancient history, a river that is wide and deep and infinitely calm. The long afternoon of the living God is drawing to a close, not with a crash, but with the soft, shimmering glow of a twilight that promises a peaceful sleep. Every stone of the temples, every grain of sand in the desert seems to pulse with the memory of this reign, a legacy of stone and spirit that will endure for thousands of years. In this quiet space, we let go of the need to understand the passage of time. We simply exist within it, like the stars that Ramses watched from his observatory, stars that have seen the rise and fall of countless empires. The breath of the pharaoh is slow and steady, a mirror to our own, as he finds his rest in the house he built for eternity. The shadows in the great hall grow longer, merging into a single velvety darkness that is both protective and profound. We sink into this darkness, knowing that the story is complete, that the work is done, and that the peace of the great ancestor is now our own. The scent of frankincense and cedarwood lingers in the heavy, still air of the royal bedchamber, a final earthly fragrance for a man who has breathed the air of 90 summers. At the age of 91, the heart of Ramses the Great, a heart that beat for Egypt through wars, through the building of mountain-sized monuments, and through the births of over 100 children, finally slows to a rhythmic, peaceful halt. The great ancestor has crossed the threshold, transitioning from the living God on earth to a divine spirit among the stars. The silence that follows is not one of tragedy, but of a profound, completed destiny. Outside the palace walls, the Nile continues its eternal flow, its waters shimmering under a moon that has watched this king since he was a small child, playing in the Delta Silt. As the news of his passing ripples through the streets of Pi Ramses, the city he founded and loved, a collective hush falls over the land of Egypt. The people do not mourn as if for a stranger. They mourn for the only father the nation has known for 66 years. But even in this stillness, the work of eternity begins. The priests of the embalming house, the masters of the sacred arts, approach the royal body with a reverence that borders on the holy. They understand that their task is to defy time itself, to bridge the gap between the physical and the infinite. With delicate rhythmic precision, they begin the 70-day process of mummification. Each organ is treated with the respect due to a vessel of the divine, placed into canopic jars that will guard them for thousands of years. The body is bathed in the salts of the Natron Valley, a gentle drying process that preserves the very features that once commanded the respect of the Hittites and the Libyans. As the days turn into weeks, the priests wrap the pharaoh in miles of the finest white linen. Between the layers, they tuck golden amulets, scarabs carved from lapis lazuli, and protective spells written on papyrus, ensuring that Ramses will have every tool he needs to navigate the winding paths of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. His skin is rubbed with precious oils, myrrh, cassia, and cedar, scents that will remain trapped within his wrappings for 3 millennia. They place a mask of gold over his face, a shimmering reflection of his eternal youth, ensuring that when he awakens in the field of reeds, he will recognize himself as the king he always was. The journey to his final resting place is a spectacle of light and shadow. The royal barge, draped in purple and gold, carries the massive granite sarcophagus across the Nile, heading toward the western bank where the sun sets each evening. The oars dip into the water with a rhythmic splash. 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 A heartbeat for the river itself. Behind the royal vessel, a fleet of hundreds follows, their torches reflecting in the dark water like a fallen constellation. The wailing of the professional mourners rises into the cool night air, a haunting, musical sound that speaks of a loss too great for words. They travel toward the Valley of the Kings, a hidden sanctuary of stone and silence tucked away in the folds of the Theban hills. In the depths of the valley, the craftsmen have been working for decades on tomb number 7. It is a vast, subterranean palace carved directly into the heart of the mountain. The walls are covered in vibrant blues, deep reds, and shimmering golds, depicting the journey of the sun through the 12 hours of the night. As the priests carry the heavy sarcophagus down the sloping corridors, the air grows cooler, smelling of dry dust and ancient stone. They pass through halls of pillars and chambers filled with the treasures of a lifetime. Golden chariots, ivory chairs, and jars of honey that will never spoil. Finally, the king is laid to rest in the burial chamber. The heavy stone lid is lowered into place, and the entrance is sealed with rubble and prayer. The lights are extinguished one by one, leaving Ramses in the velvet embrace of the mountain. But history is rarely a straight line, and even the mountains can be restless. As the centuries passed and the glory of the new kingdom faded into the twilight of the third intermediate period, the Valley of the Kings became vulnerable. Grave robbers, driven by desperation and the lure of gold, began to haunt the silent corridors of the ancestors. To protect the sacred remains of their greatest kings, the high priests of the 21st dynasty performed a final act of devotion. In the dead of night, by the flickering light of small lamps, they quietly reopened the tomb of Ramses. They did not find a king in ruins, but a father who needed a safer home. They moved his mummy, along with those of his father Seti and his grandfather Ramses I, to a secret shaft hidden in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. There, in a narrow limestone crevice overlooking the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, Ramses the Great slept in total darkness for nearly 3,000 years. The world above him changed beyond recognition. Languages died out. New religions rose, and the very name of Egypt became a mystery of broken stones and forgotten scripts. Yet, in the cool, dry air of the cache, the pharaoh remained perfectly preserved. His aquiline nose and high cheekbones still visible, his hands crossed over his chest in a gesture of eternal patience. He was no longer a king of a specific empire, but a passenger on the long ship of time, waiting for the world to remember him. The silence was finally broken in the late 19th century. In 1881, after rumours of royal artefacts appearing on the antiquities market reached the ears of officials, the hidden cache was discovered. When the archaeologists first lowered themselves into the dark shaft, their torches illuminated a sight that took their breath away. Dozens of coffins were stacked one upon another, the names of the greatest pharaohs of history written in elegant hieroglyphs upon their lids. And there, in a simple wooden coffin that had replaced his original golden one, lay Ramses II. His journey into the modern world had begun. He was transported down the Nile once more, but this time on a steamship. As the vessel passed the villages along the riverbanks, the modern Egyptians, the descendants of his own subjects, came out to pay their respects. Women wailed and men fired rifles into the air, a traditional salute to a passing chief, instinctively recognizing that a piece of their soul was returning home. In the 20th century, his journey even took him across the sea to Paris, where he was greeted with the full honors of a visiting head of state, a testament to the fact that His Majesty had not dimmed with the passing of 3,000 years. Today, the great ancestor rests in the quiet halls of the Grand Egyptian Museum, a short distance from the pyramids that were already ancient when he was born. Through the glass of his display, we can see the face of the man who saw the world as his garden. His hair, still tinged with the red of his youth, reminds us of his humanity, while the serenity of his expression reminds us of his divinity. He has achieved the one thing every Egyptian pharaoh craved above all else. His name has not been forgotten. It is carved into the pylons of Luxor, etched into the cliffs of Abu Simbel, and whispered by students and travellers from every corner of the globe. The permanence he sought was not just in stone, but in the collective memory of humanity. As we leave the halls of the museum and step out into the cool desert night, we look up at the same stars that Ramses once studied. The air is still, carrying the faint scent of the Nile and the cooling sand. The distant sounds of the modern world fade away, leaving only the vast, rhythmic breathing of the earth. We realize that the peace of the pharaoh is not a dead thing, but a living stillness that we can carry within ourselves. The work is done. The monuments stand. The name lives on. We drift now into a space where time has no meaning, where the boundaries between the past and the present dissolve into a soft indigo haze. The great ancestor is at rest, and so are we. The desert wind whispers through the palms, a gentle lullaby that has played for thousands of years, guiding us into a deep, restorative sleep under the watchful eyes of the eternal stars. Each breath we take is a bridge to that ancient peace, a slow and steady rhythm that carries us further into the dark, protective embrace of history, and into the quiet, and into the light of the morning yet to come.